At an exclusive gala dinner, a millionaire's elderly mother accidentally spilled wine across the pristine tablecloth. Seeing her as nothing but a burden and overcome with embarrassment, her son flew into a rage and slapped her in front of everyone. But he was completely unaware of who was watching, and soon he would bitterly regret his actions. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sleek black limousine glided through the bustling streets of New York City, its tinted windows shielding the occupants from the curious gazes of passers-by. Inside, Nathaniel Nate Baltimore, a young millionaire in his early 30s, sat engrossed in his tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen as he pored over company records. Beside him, his mother, Harriet Baltimore, a woman in her early 60s, gazed around the luxurious interior of the vehicle, her eyes wide with wonder. The soft hum of the engine and the muffled sounds of the city outside created a cocoon of silence within the limousine. Harriet, unable to contain her excitement any longer, turned to her son and asked, "Nate, dear, where exactly is this gala being held?" Without looking up from his tablet, Nate replied coldly, "The Astoria Grand Hotel." Harriet nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "This is the first time you've let me into your limousine, you know. I'll never forget this moment." She ran her hand along the smooth leather seat. "When did you get this beautiful car?" It took Nate a moment to respond, his attention still fixed on the screen before him. "I bought it 5 years ago," he said flatly. "My goodness, how time flies," Harriet mused, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "We haven't done anything together in all that time. I've missed you, Nate." She reached out as if to touch his arm, but stopped short, her hand hovering uncertainly in the air before she withdrew it. "I'm so proud of you, you know. Look at all you've accomplished. A millionaire at your age. I feel honored that you've invited me to this important event as your guest." Nate remained silent, his fingers tapping away at the tablet. Harriet, undeterred by his lack of response, pressed on. "What's tonight's event about, dear?" Finally, Nate looked up from his tablet, his expression one of barely concealed annoyance. "It's about legacy and innovation," he said, his tone clipped. "To celebrate ethical leadership, long-standing business partnerships, and introduce successors who will carry on their family businesses." He thrust the invitation at her. "Here, look for yourself. It's something you won't understand, Mom, so stop asking questions and just be quiet, for goodness sake." Harriet's face fell, but she took the invitation with trembling hands. Nate continued, his voice softening slightly but still carrying an edge of impatience. "I need you to behave tonight, Mom. I didn't bring you here to have fun. There's an important businessman I need to meet, Henry Caldwell. He's well known for valuing family legacy in his business management." "Oh," Harriet perked up, eager to show interest. "And who is this Mr. Caldwell?" Nate sighed. "As I said, he's in infrastructure and real estate development. He's about your age, early 60s. His son, Ben Caldwell, who's around my age, will be there too. Ben's already deeply involved in his father's corporation and is set to inherit the business." Harriet nodded, trying to absorb the information. Nate continued, "That's why I decided to bring you. I want to make a good impression, show that we have a strong family even though Dad's gone. I need to network and conduct business with these important people for the company to survive." He paused, then added with a hint of sarcasm, "Maybe you can charm the business guy, show the good side of our family. That's basically the point of tonight and why I need you here." Harriet's heart sank at his words. "Nate, do you really mean that? Is that the only reason you asked me to come?" Nate's jaw tightened. "So what if it is? If you need another reason, consider it an opportunity to attend a high-class event, meet other millionaires, and indulge in fine food and wine." "That's not what I meant," Harriet said softly. "It's just, we haven't seen each other in years. I had hoped you asked me because you missed me." Nate's expression hardened. "I miss Dad," he said coldly. "Dad would know what to do at an event like this. He'd make the most of the opportunity. That's what I intend to do tonight." Harriet fell silent, her son's words striking her like a physical blow. She turned to look out the window, blinking back tears as memories of her late husband, Charles Baltimore, flooded her mind. Charles had passed away when Nate was in his teens, leaving them with a substantial inheritance. But Harriet had struggled to manage the finances alone, relying entirely on what Charles had left behind instead of growing it further. The company Charles had worked so hard to build had nearly collapsed before Nate reached the legal age and stepped in to save his father's legacy. Guilt washed over Harriet as she realized the strain in her relationship with Nate was largely her own doing. He must view her as weak and dependent, associating her with failure because she had wasted opportunities and lacked ambition. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. If there was any chance of repairing her relationship with her son, she had to do her best tonight. "All right, I promise to give it my all tonight," she said, injecting forced enthusiasm into her voice. Nate opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the limousine came to a smooth stop. The chauffeur's voice came through the intercom. "We've arrived at the Astoria Grand Hotel, sir." The chauffeur swung open the limousine door, and Nate stepped out first, his polished shoes catching the soft evening light. Without a glance in her direction, he extended a hand toward Harriet, his gaze fixed on the hotel entrance. She still accepted it gratefully, a flicker of warmth stirring in her chest despite his distraction. As she emerged from the car, a quiet gasp escaped her lips at the sight before her. A plush red carpet stretched from the curb to the grand entrance of the Astoria Grand Hotel. The building itself was a masterpiece of architecture, its facade adorned with intricate stonework and gleaming gold accents. Spotlights illuminated the scene, casting a warm glow over the arriving guests, many of whom were dressed in stunning gowns and impeccable tuxedos. Harriet smoothed down her own blue dress, suddenly feeling self-conscious. She glanced at Nate, who was already scanning the crowd, his eyes sharp and calculating. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand on his arm, and together they began to walk down the red carpet. As they approached the entrance, a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s stepped forward to greet them. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his tailored suit spoke of wealth and taste. Nate's posture immediately straightened, and a practiced smile spread across his face. "Mr. Caldwell," Nate said, extending his hand, "it's a pleasure to see you again." Henry Caldwell shook Nate's hand firmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Nathaniel, welcome. I'm glad you could make it." His gaze shifted to Harriet, and his smile widened. "And this must be your mother. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Baltimore." Harriet felt a wave of relief wash over her at Henry's warm greeting. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Caldwell," she said, offering her hand. "Please call me Harriet." As they exchanged pleasantries, Harriet found herself drawn into the conversation. Henry spoke about his journey in the sustainable infrastructure and real estate development industry, his words painting a picture of a man who had worked hard to build his empire from the ground up. "It's good to see a few entrepreneurs still bringing their family along," Henry remarked, his eyes twinkling. "My son Ben is here tonight as well. He'll be taking over the company when I retire, which isn't too far off now." Harriet nodded, feeling a connection with this kind, humble man who seemed to share her values. She remembered Nate's earlier words about making a good impression and felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps tonight wouldn't be as difficult as she had feared. "We look forward to speaking with you later about business, Mr. Caldwell," Nate said, his tone professional but eager. Henry nodded. Of course, we'll catch up after dinner. Enjoy the gala, both of you." As Henry moved away to greet other guests, Nate and Harriet continued towards the ballroom, where the gala was being held. The red carpet extended into the hotel, guiding them towards the main event. Harriet's heart swelled with pride as she walked beside her son, feeling for a moment like they were truly a team. But as they neared the ballroom doors, disaster struck. Harriet's heel caught on a slight bump in the carpet, and before she could catch herself, she stumbled forward. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her arms flailing in a desperate attempt to regain her balance. With a soft thud, she landed on her hands and knees, her face burning with embarrassment. "Mom!" Nate hissed, his voice low and angry. "How embarrassing," he muttered, just loud enough for Harriet to hear but not for others to notice. He quickly helped her to her feet, a forced smile plastered on his face as he glanced around to see if anyone had witnessed the fall. "I'm so sorry," Harriet whispered, her cheeks flushed. "My heel caught on something. It's been so long since I've worn heels like this." Nate's grip on her arm tightened as he led her into the ballroom. "Walk straight," he whispered through clenched teeth, "and try not to embarrass us any further." Harriet's heart sank as they made their way to their assigned table. She had hoped to make Nate proud, to show him that she could fit into his world. Instead, she had only reinforced his view of her as a liability. As they sat down, she vowed to herself that she would do better. She had to, for Nate's sake and for the chance to rebuild their relationship. The grand ballroom of the Astoria Grand Hotel was a symphony of elegance and opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high, ornate ceiling, their soft light cascading down to create a warm, golden glow that danced across the faces of the gathered elite. The air was filled with the gentle murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional tinkling of fine crystal and the muted clink of silverware against bone china. Dozens of circular tables, each draped in pristine white linen that seemed to glow under the chandelier's light, were arranged throughout the vast space. Despite the grandeur of the room, the layout created an atmosphere of intimacy, as if each table was its own private island in a sea of luxury. A waitress, her crisp black and white uniform, a stark contrast to the colorful evening gowns and tuxedos of the guests, approached Nate and Harriet with practiced grace. Her steps were silent on the plush carpet as she led them to their table, nestled near the center of the room. With fluid movements, she pulled out their chairs and waited for them to be seated, before draping crisp, starched napkins across their laps. "Good evening, Mr. Baltimore, Mrs. Baltimore," the waitress said, her voice pitched low to match the hushed tones of the room. A polite smile graced her features as she continued, "We'll be serving dinner as the gala begins. For the main course, we have options for proteins and wine. May I take your selections?" Nate, his posture relaxed yet commanding, spoke first. His voice carried the easy confidence of a man accustomed to such events. "I'll have the Wagyu and a glass of red wine, please." Harriet's eyes darted nervously over the menu, the unfamiliar dishes and wine pairings making her heart race. She cleared her throat softly before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'll have the salmon." "Mum," Nate interrupted, his voice low but sharp, cutting through her words like a knife. His eyes, cold and disapproving, bore into hers as he leaned closer. "We don't want smelly breath when talking to Henry later. Choose something else." Harriet's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, the heat creeping up her neck and face. She could feel the waitress's eyes on her, and though the young woman's expression remained neutral, Harriet imagined she could see pity there. Swallowing hard, she forced a smile and spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, of course. I'm sorry. I'll have the quail and red wine, please." The waitress nodded, her pen scratching softly against her notepad as she recorded their orders. With a final, "Very good, sir, madam," she glided away, disappearing into the sea of tables and guests. As soon as the waitress was out of earshot, Nate turned to Harriet, his expression stern, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with intensity. "Mum, I need you to concentrate and behave for just a few hours," he said, each word deliberate and weighted. "This is an important business deal and I can't afford any more embarrassing incidents. Can you manage that?" Harriet nodded, her throat tight, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. "Of course, Nate," she managed, her voice small and uncertain. "I promise I'll do better. I'm just so glad and honored to be here with you tonight." Nate didn't respond. His attention was already elsewhere, his eyes scanning the room with the sharp focus of a predator assessing its territory. He seemed to be making mental notes, cataloguing the faces and positions of various guests, his mind no doubt formulating strategies and potential conversations. Harriet watched him, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within her. Pride at her son's poise and determination, warred with a deep, aching sadness at the distance between them. When had her little boy become this driven, successful yet cold man? She longed to bridge the gap, to find some way to connect with him. Summoning her courage, Harriet tried once more to engage him. "You know, Nate," she began, her voice soft and tentative, "I really am proud of all you've accomplished. Your father would be—" "Just stay quiet and smile until we're finished with the business deal later, Mom," Nate cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. His eyes, when they flicked briefly to her face, were hard and impatient. "That's all I need from you tonight." Harriet fell silent, the words she had hoped to say dying on her lips. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to quell the trembling that had started in her fingers. As the lights in the hall dimmed slightly, and the master of ceremonies took the stage to welcome the guests, Harriet found herself retreating inward. The master of ceremonies' voice boomed through hidden speakers, filling the vast room with practiced enthusiasm. But to Harriet, the words were a distant buzz, overshadowed by the thundering of her own heartbeat in her ears. She focused all her energy on maintaining her posture, on keeping a pleasant, neutral expression on her face. She was determined to be the perfect, silent companion her son seemed to want, even as a part of her withered at the thought. As applause rippled through the crowd in response to something the master of ceremonies had said, Harriet Baltimore sat straight-backed in her chair, a study in poise and elegance to any casual observer. But beneath the surface, in the depths of her heart, she had never felt more alone. The weight of his expectations pressed down on her like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe in the perfumed air of the ballroom. The server returned to their table, moving with the silent grace of one long accustomed to navigating crowded rooms while balancing precious cargo. His tray, laden with delicate wine glasses filled with deep red liquid, seemed to float effortlessly in his practiced hands. "Your wine, sir, madam," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as he placed the glasses before them. The wine was a deep, rich red, looking both inviting and somehow dangerous to Harriet's nervous eyes. Nate's attention remained fixed on the stage, his sharp gaze focused on the speaker. His eyes were narrowed slightly in concentration, his mind no doubt already racing with potential business strategies and networking opportunities. He seemed oblivious to the server's presence, let alone to his mother's growing discomfort beside him. Harriet, feeling the need to do something, anything to prove her worth, reached for her wine glass. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it, the weight of the crystal unfamiliar and awkward in her grasp. Time seemed to stretch as the glass tipped in her hand. Harriet watched, detached, as a wave of red wine rose to the rim, teetering on the edge before surrendering to gravity. A single ruby droplet lingered for a heartbeat, then fell, shattering the stillness. The liquid splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, blooming into a vivid stain. Tiny droplets flecked Harriet's dress, each one a quiet emblem of her failure. Harriet gasped, the sound barely audible over the speaker's voice, but it was enough to draw Nate's attention. His head snapped around, his eyes widening in shock as he took in the scene before him. In that moment, Harriet saw a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment, disgust, fury, before his face hardened into a mask of cold anger. In a split second, before Harriet could even begin to apologize, Nate's hand shot out. The sharp crack of his palm connecting with her cheek seemed to echo in Harriet's ears, drowning out the ongoing speech and the ambient noise of the room. The sting of the slap bloomed across her face, hot and shameful. "You're so embarrassing," Nate hissed, his voice low and venomous. His words cut deeper than the physical blow, each one a dagger to Harriet's heart. "You can't even drink wine properly. You should have just ordered water, you incompetent—" Harriet's vision blurred with tears, her cheek burning from the slap and her heart aching from the cruel words. She blinked rapidly, trying to stem the flow of tears that threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup. The taste of salt mingled with the lingering flavor of wine on her lips, a bitter reminder of her failure. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. "The lighting. I couldn't see well. I'll clean it up quickly in the bathroom." Nate's jaw clenched, the muscle twitching beneath his skin as he fought to control his anger. His eyes darted around the room, assessing whether anyone had noticed the commotion. Most of the guests seemed oblivious, their attention still focused on the stage, but Nate's paranoia was palpable. "Fine," he spat, the word filled with barely contained rage. "And call the waiter on your way out. I'm not going to call them and let everyone think I stained the tablecloth." Harriet nodded mutely, pushing her chair back as quietly as possible. The soft scrape of the chair legs against the carpet seemed deafening to her ears. As she stood, she noticed the deep red stain spreading across her lap, a visual representation of her failure. The once beautiful blue dress, chosen with such care and hope for the evening, was now ruined, much like her relationship with her son. I'll let the server by the door know about the spill," she murmured, her words barely audible. She made her way towards the exit, her steps unsteady, feeling as though every eye in the room was upon her, even though most guests remained focused on the ongoing presentation. The plush carpet seemed to shift beneath her feet, making each step a challenge. As she passed the server stationed by the door, she leaned in close, the scent of his cologne mingling with the lingering aroma of spilled wine. "I'm so sorry," Harriet whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "But there's been a spill at our table. Table 18. Could someone—" The server nodded sympathetically, his eyes kind. "Of course, madam. We'll take care of it right away." Harriet hurried out into the hotel corridor, her cheeks burning with shame, her heart pounding in her chest. The cool air of the hallway was a shock after the warmth of the ballroom, raising goosebumps on her bare arms. She was so focused on finding the restroom, on escaping the scene of her humiliation, that she didn't notice the man who had been sitting at the table behind them, following her out. As she neared the bathroom, a gentle voice called out, stopping her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am." "Are you all right?" Harriet turned, her heart leaping into her throat. The man who had addressed her was tall and distinguished, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners with concern. His tuxedo was impeccably tailored, speaking of wealth and taste. She recognized him as the one who had been seated at the table directly behind them, and the realization that he might have witnessed her humiliation made her want to sink into the floor. I'm fine," she stammered, her hand unconsciously rising to her cheek, where Nate had struck her. The skin there was hot to the touch, and she wondered if a red mark was visible. The man's expression softened further, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and something that looked like anger, though not directed at her. "I couldn't help but notice what happened," he said gently, his voice low and soothing. "That man who slapped you, was he your son?" Harriet felt a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. This kind stranger had witnessed her humiliation, had seen how her own son treated her. But even now, even after everything, she couldn't bring herself to speak ill of Nate. The instinct to protect him, to shield him from judgment, was too deeply ingrained. "Yes, he is," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She could hear the tremble in her own words. "But he didn't mean to hurt me. It was my fault, really. I was so clumsy, spilling the wine like that at such an important event." The man shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and something that looked like anger, though not directed at her. "No one deserves to be treated like that," he said firmly, his voice gentle but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Especially not by their own child. I would never dream of raising a hand to my mother, no matter what happened." Harriet's breath caught in her throat as the man introduced himself, extending his hand. "I'm Ben Caldwell," he said, his voice warm and kind. In that moment, Harriet felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. This was Henry Caldwell's son, one of the very person Nate had been so eager to impress, and he had witnessed everything. Harriet's mind raced as she stood face to face with Ben Caldwell. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. She had to salvage this somehow for Nate's sake. "Mr. Caldwell," she managed, forcing a smile onto her face, "it's a pleasure to meet you. Your father seems like a wonderful man. We met him briefly before the event started." Ben's kind eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made Harriet want to shrink away. "Please, call me Ben," he said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "And yes, my father is a good man. He values family above all else in business and in life." Harriet nodded, her smile wavering. The mention of family values sent a pang through her heart, a sharp reminder of how far her own family had strayed from such ideals. "That's wonderful," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son, Nate, he's actually hoping to discuss some important business with your father after the event." Ben's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Nate, a flicker of something, disapproval, anger, passing across his features before he quickly schooled them back into a neutral mask. "I see," he said carefully, weighing each word. "And how do you feel about that, Mrs. Baltimore?" The question caught Harriet off guard, like a sudden gust of wind that threatened to knock her off balance. How did she feel? She couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her that, least of all Nate. The realization sent a wave of sadness washing over her, threatening to drown her in its depths. I'm proud of my son," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. They hung in the air between them, fragile and unconvincing. "He's worked so hard to build up his father's company." Ben nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. There was a gentleness in his gaze that made Harriet want to weep, to pour out all the pain and loneliness she had been carrying for so long. "And your role in the company?" he asked softly. Harriet felt a flush of shame creep up her neck, spreading across her cheeks like wildfire. "Oh no," she admitted, her voice small and uncertain. "I'm afraid I don't know much about the business world. Nate handles all of that." A look of understanding passed over Ben's face, tinged with something that might have been sadness. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but Harriet, suddenly aware of how long she'd been gone and fearing Nate's reaction, cut him off. "I'm so sorry, but I really must clean up," she said, gesturing to her stained dress. The wine had begun to dry, leaving a dark, accusing mark on the once beautiful fabric. "My son will be wondering where I am. It was lovely to meet you, Ben. I'm sure we'll see each other again later." Ben nodded, a hint of reluctance in his eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Baltimore. Please take care of yourself." As Harriet turned to enter the restroom, Ben's voice stopped her once more. "Mrs. Baltimore." She looked back at him, her hand on the door handle. "Remember, you have value beyond what others see in you." With those words hanging in the air, Ben turned and walked back towards the event hall, leaving Harriet standing alone in the corridor, her emotions a tangled mess. Inside the restroom, Harriet stood before the large mirror, the harsh fluorescent lighting accentuating every line on her face, every flaw in her appearance. She dabbed at the wine stain on her dress with a damp paper towel, but the red mark seemed to mock her efforts, spreading further with each attempt to remove it. As she worked, Harriet's mind wandered back to earlier times, when she would accompany her late husband, Charles, to events like these. She remembered how proud he always was to have her by his side, how he would beam at her as she charmed their business associates with her wit and grace. But those days were long gone, faded like old photographs. Now she was just an embarrassment, a liability to her son's ambitions. Harriet looked at her reflection, really looked, and saw an aging woman with sagging skin and tired eyes. Gone was the confident, elegant wife of a successful businessman. In her place stood a woman who didn't know how to navigate this world of wealth and power, a woman who had let her son down in every conceivable way. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about how she had failed not just Nate, but Charles as well. When Charles died 15 years ago, leaving her with a substantial inheritance and a thriving company, she had been lost. She had never worked, never needed to. Charles had always insisted that her job was to raise their son, to create a loving home. And she had done that, or so she thought. But when it came to managing the company, to growing the wealth Charles had left them, she had been woefully unprepared. She had used the inheritance to maintain their lifestyle, never thinking about the future, never considering how to make the money work for them. And as a result, she had nearly let Charles's life's work crumble. Harriet's hands shook as she tried to fix her makeup, wiping away the tear stains and reapplying her eyeliner. The small makeup bag she carried seemed inadequate for the task of repairing not just her appearance, but her dignity. She had to pull herself together. Nate needed her to make a good impression tonight, and despite everything, she was determined not to let him down again. As she stared at her reflection, trying to summon the strength to face the rest of the evening, Harriet made a silent promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to make things right with Nate, to prove to him that she could be the mother he needed. Even if it meant swallowing her pride, even if it meant enduring more of his harsh words and cold demeanor. With a deep breath, Harriet straightened her shoulders and smoothed down her dress one last time. The wine stain was still visible, a stark reminder of her failings, but there was nothing more she could do about it now. It was time to return to the gala, to face Nate, and to try one more time to be the mother he deserved. Harriet stepped back into the event hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was alive with the soft murmur of conversation and the gentle clink of cutlery against fine china. As she made her way back to their table, she noticed that the stained tablecloth had been replaced with a pristine white one, and fresh cutlery gleamed in the soft light. Nate was already halfway through his steak, his attention focused solely on his plate and the stage where speakers continued to address the crowd. As Harriet took her seat, she noticed that her wine glass had been replaced with a glass of plain water. Her quail and mashed potatoes sat untouched, steam no longer rising from the plate. She cast a quick glance at the table behind them, catching Ben Caldwell's eye. He offered her a small, encouraging smile, which she returned with a slight nod before turning back to her own table. Nate, absorbed in his meal and the ongoing presentations, seemed oblivious to the brief interaction. Harriet picked up her fork, her appetite diminished by the events of the evening, but knowing she should at least make an effort to eat. She took small, careful bites of the quail, barely tasting the expertly prepared dish. Her mind raced with worry about the upcoming meeting with Henry Caldwell, and how her earlier mishaps might affect Nate's chances of securing the deal. As she ate, she couldn't help but notice how Nate devoured his meal, washing it down with generous sips of red wine. His eyes never left the stage, his posture tense with anticipation. Harriet wondered what thoughts were running through his mind, what strategies he was formulating for the impending business discussion. When Nate finished his meal, a server appeared at their table to collect the plates. "I hope you enjoyed your meal," the young man said politely. "We'll be serving dessert shortly." Nate's eyes flickered to Harriet's plate, still half full, and he clicked his tongue in disapproval. Harriet, catching his look, quickly set down her fork. "I'm finished as well," she said softly to the server. "You can take my plate." As the server walked away with their dishes, Nate finally turned his attention to Harriet. His eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, lingering on the wine stain that still marred her dress. "The only way you can restore my faith in you," he said, his voice low and cold, "is to make sure you represent me well when we talk with Henry later. Otherwise, I don't want to see you ever again. You can live alone for as long as you want in that stinky suburb." Harriet felt as though she had been struck again, the pain of his words far worse than any physical blow. "Nate," she whispered, her voice trembling, "do you really mean that? It's so cruel." Nate's expression hardened. "You're so helpless," he spat. "I hate weak women." With that, he turned away, his attention once again fixed on the stage. Harriet sat in stunned silence, her son's words echoing in her mind. She wanted to cry, to scream, to shake Nate, and ask him how he could treat his own mother this way. But she knew she couldn't. She had to stay strong, had to prove to him that she wasn't weak, that she could be useful. The dessert arrived, a delicate chocolate creation that would have normally delighted Harriet, but now it sat before her like a mockery of the sweet relationship she had once hoped to have with her son. She noticed that people at other tables were beginning to rise, mingling and networking as the formal dinner portion of the evening came to an end. Nate stood abruptly. "Wait here," he commanded. "I'm going to talk to some people. Don't move, don't talk to anyone. Just sit here and try not to embarrass me any further." As Nate walked away, disappearing into the crowd of well-dressed attendees, Harriet was left alone at the table. She picked up her dessert spoon with a trembling hand, determined to at least appear composed and elegant. Each tiny bite of the rich chocolate was a struggle, the sweetness turning to ash in her mouth as she fought back tears. She watched as Nate moved confidently from group to group, shaking hands and laughing at jokes she couldn't hear. In that moment, surrounded by the glittering crowd and the sounds of success, Harriet Baltimore had never felt more isolated and out of place. She silently prayed for strength to get through the rest of the evening, hoping against hope that somehow she could still make her son proud. The dinner event gradually wound down, the buzz of conversation growing louder as more guests left their tables to mingle. Harriet remained seated, following Nate's instructions to the letter, her barely touched dessert a silent testament to her anxiety. She watched as her son navigated the room with ease, his charm and confidence on full display as he shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with various influential figures. After what felt like an eternity, Nate made his way back to their table. His expression was unreadable as he approached, but Harriet could sense a mix of anticipation and tension radiating from him. "Well," Nate said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "it's just like you to sit here nicely and quietly, not using this opportunity to network at all." Harriet's heart sank. "But Nate, you told me to stay here." "Ambitious people know how to carry themselves," Nate cut her off. "They don't just stay quiet when someone tells them to be quiet. They know what to do, how to make the most of every situation." Harriet bit her lip, trying to contain the hurt and frustration that threatened to spill over. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was to come next. As she was about to respond, she caught sight of a familiar figure approaching from behind Nate. Henry Caldwell, his silver hair gleaming in the soft light of the ballroom, was making his way towards their table. Harriet's eyes widened and she quickly raised a finger to her lips, silently urging Nate to be quiet. Nate, misinterpreting her gesture, scowled, clearly about to berate her again. But before he could speak, Henry's warm voice rang out behind him. "Nathaniel, Mrs. Baltimore, I hope you've enjoyed the evening so far." In an instant, Nate's demeanor changed. He turned, a broad smile plastered on his face, all traces of his previous anger vanishing as if they had never existed. "Mr. Caldwell, yes, it's been a wonderful event. Thank you so much for having us." Harriet stood, smoothing down her dress and hoping the wine stain wasn't too noticeable in the dim light. She extended her hand to Henry, grateful for his kind smile. "It's been lovely, Mr. Caldwell. Thank you for your hospitality." Henry shook her hand warmly, his eyes twinkling. "Please call me Henry. I'm glad you've enjoyed yourselves. Nathaniel, I believe you mentioned wanting to discuss some business." Nate nodded eagerly. "Yes, if you have the time, I'd love to talk about some potential collaborations and partnerships." Of course," Henry said. "Why don't we move to one of the private rooms for a bit more privacy? It's getting rather loud in here." As Henry spoke, Harriet noticed another figure joining their group. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Ben Caldwell, his kind eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he turned to his father. "Dad, is this the Baltimore family you mentioned?" Ben asked, his voice carefully neutral. Henry beamed. "Indeed it is. Nathaniel, Mrs. Baltimore, this is my son, Ben. He'll be joining us for our discussion, if that's all right with you." Nate's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, that would be wonderful. The more the merrier, right?" Harriet, sensing Nate's discomfort, quickly spoke up. "It's lovely to meet you, Ben. Your father speaks very highly of you." Ben's eyes met hers again, a flicker of concern passing through them. "Actually, Mrs. Baltimore and I met briefly earlier, outside the restrooms." Nate's head whipped around, his eyes wide with barely concealed panic. Harriet felt her heart race, wondering what Ben might say next. But Ben simply smiled. "It was a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Baltimore. I'm looking forward to our discussion." Henry clapped his hands together. "Excellent. Shall we move to the VVIP room then? It's just down the corridor." Nate, seemingly relieved that Ben hadn't mentioned anything about the incident he had witnessed, nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds perfect. Mom, why don't you stay here and enjoy the rest of the event? We wouldn't want to bore you with business talk." But Henry shook his head. "Nonsense, Mrs. Baltimore must join us. After all, this involves her late husband's company, doesn't it? Family businesses should involve the whole family, in my opinion." Nate's smile became strained, but he nodded in agreement. "Of course, you're right. Mom, please join us." As they made their way out of the event hall and towards the VVIP room, Harriet couldn't help but notice how Ben held the door open for all of them, his manners impeccable. She thought sadly of how Nate had never shown her such courtesy. The small group entered the VVIP room, its plush furnishings and subdued lighting creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and importance. As they settled into the comfortable leather chairs, Harriet took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew that this meeting could change everything for Nate, for better or worse. And somehow she sensed that her role in this discussion might be more crucial than she could have ever imagined. The VVIP room exuded an air of quiet opulence, with its rich mahogany paneling and soft amber lighting. As they settled into the plush leather chairs arranged around a polished conference table, Harriet couldn't help but feel out of place. She perched on the edge of her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap, acutely aware of the wine stain on her dress and the weight of expectation hanging in the air. Nate, by contrast, seemed to come alive in this setting. He leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with anticipation as he addressed Henry Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, thank you again for taking the time to meet with us. I believe there's a tremendous opportunity for collaboration between our companies." Henry nodded, his expression neutral but attentive. "I'm always interested in potential partnerships, Nathaniel. Why don't you tell us more about what you have in mind?" Nate launched into his pitch, his voice confident and passionate, as he spoke about his company's growth over the years. He detailed the economic trends they had capitalized on, the innovative strategies they had implemented, and the impressive returns they had seen as a result. As he spoke, he pulled out a tablet, swiping through slides of graphs and charts that illustrated his points. "As you can see, Mr. Caldwell," Nate said, his eyes gleaming with pride, "we've managed to increase our market share by 15% in the last quarter alone. With your expertise in sustainable infrastructure and our innovative approach to real estate development, I believe we could create something truly revolutionary." Throughout Nate's presentation, Harriet remained silent, feeling increasingly out of her depth. The business jargon and financial terms Nate used so effortlessly might as well have been a foreign language to her. She tried to follow along, to show interest and engagement, but she could feel her confusion mounting with each passing minute. After Nate had finished his pitch, laying out his vision for a potential collaboration, Henry turned to Harriet. His kind eyes met hers, and she felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Mrs. Baltimore," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm, "what are your thoughts on this? Do you fully support your son's decision?" Harriet felt as though she had been thrown into icy water. She opened her mouth, then closed it again at a loss for words. Nate shot her a warning glance, but Henry's raised hand stopped him from speaking on her behalf. "I want to hear from Harriet," Henry said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Swallowing hard, Harriet forced herself to speak. I agree with my son's decision," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He has spoken well about the company. I'm very proud of what he's accomplished." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Harriet's face. She had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her facade, could sense her discomfort and lack of understanding. "Harriet," Henry said, leaning forward slightly, "how much are you involved in the company's upper management and decision-making processes?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Nate shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with this line of questioning. Harriet felt a bead of sweat form on her brow as she struggled to find an appropriate answer. Well, you see," she stammered, looking to Nate for help. But her son's face was a mask of barely concealed irritation. Nate cleared his throat, attempting to take control of the conversation. Mr. Caldwell, if I may, my mother has very little involvement in the day-to-day operations of the company. She's not accustomed to the corporate world, so I've been the one taking charge and building on my father's legacy. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly at this. I see, he said, his tone neutral. And after your father passed away, Nathaniel, did you not think it important to help your mother learn about management? It is a family business, after all. Shouldn't it be a joint effort? Nate's confident demeanor faltered for a moment. With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell, that's a family decision. Given my mother's limited knowledge of business, starting from scratch would have taken too much time. She's not as young as she used to be. Henry let out a short laugh, though there was little humor in it. My boy, that excuse might offend me. I'm not exactly a spring chicken myself, but I'm still capable of learning new things every day. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, becoming tense and uncomfortable. Nate's earlier confidence was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He glanced at Harriet, as if suddenly remembering her presence before turning back to Henry. Mr. Caldwell, Nate said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration, I'm not sure I understand. We came here to discuss a potential business partnership. Why are we talking about my family arrangements? Henry leaned back in his chair, exchanging a significant look with his son, Ben. The younger Caldwell had been silent throughout the exchange, but his eyes had never left Harriet, watching her reactions with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Nathaniel, Henry said, his voice grave, I'm afraid we need to have a different kind of conversation. You see, my son Ben told me everything he witnessed earlier this evening. He said let's just say you patted your mother a little too hard on the cheek. Nate's face drained of color, his eyes widening in shock. Harriet felt her heart drop, realizing that the moment she had been dreading had finally arrived. The carefully constructed facade they had built for this meeting was crumbling before her eyes, and she was powerless to stop it. As the truth of their family dynamics began to unravel in that opulent VVIP room, Harriet Baltimore found herself at a crossroads. The choices made in the next few moments would shape not just the future of their business, but the very fabric of their family. And for the first time in years, she felt a spark of something long forgotten, the courage to speak her truth. The tension in the VVIP room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Nate sat stiffly, his confidence crumbling as his gaze flickered between Henry, Ben, and Harriet, searching for an escape. Harriet felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread for the inevitable confrontation, relief that the charade was finally over. Nate's shock dissolved into fury. He turned to Harriet, his eyes burning with betrayal. "Mum, what did you do?" he hissed, voice low and sharp. "What did you tell them?" Before she could answer, Henry raised a hand, silencing him with a hard stare. "Your mother didn't say a word, Nathaniel. She didn't have to. Ben saw everything. He sat just behind you at dinner. The slap, the cruel words, nothing escaped his notice." Nate's face paled further, if that was possible. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For once, the silver-tongued businessman was at a loss. Harriet, seeing the distress in her son's eyes despite everything, felt the familiar urge to protect him stir within her. She leaned forward, her hands gripping tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "Mr. Caldwell, please," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I know what Ben saw must have looked awful, but you have to understand. Nate's been under so much pressure. He's worked so hard to build his father's company, and tonight's event must have taken a toll on him. I'm just not as smart as him, you see. I don't understand the business, but please, for the sake of the company, for my husband's legacy." Her words trailed off as she saw the look of disappointment on Henry's face. Ben, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Baltimore," he said, "you don't have to make excuses for him. No amount of pressure justifies treating someone, let alone one's own mother, the way Nate treated you tonight." Nate, having regained some of his composure, straightened in his chair. His businessman's mask slipped back into place, though it was noticeably strained. "Mr. Caldwell, I apologize if there's been some misunderstanding. What happens in my family is private. I assure you it has no bearing on my ability to run a successful business or to be a valuable partner to your company? Henry nodded slowly, considering Nate's words. He exchanged a look with Ben, a silent communication passing between father and son. After a moment, he turned back to Nate and Harriet. "I understand your position, Nathaniel," Henry said, his voice measured, "and I appreciate your mother's desire to protect you and your father's legacy. However, I'm afraid I can't simply overlook what's happened, especially given what our research has uncovered." Nate's brow furrowed. "Research? What are you talking about?" Ben leaned forward, his expression serious. "We always do our due diligence before entering into major partnerships, Nathaniel. In reviewing your company's history, we discovered that you bought out your mother's share in the company some years ago." Harriet's eyes widened in shock. She knew Nate had taken control of the company and had given her a sum of money years ago, but she hadn't realized he had completely bought her out. The memory of signing those papers Nate had placed in front of her, papers she hadn't fully understood at the time, came rushing back. Nate's face hardened, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Are you saying you're going to terminate our deal over a private family matter?" Henry held up a hand. "Not necessarily, but there will be conditions." He paused, making sure he had Nate's full attention. "Effective immediately, all current deals between our companies will be terminated." Nate's face fell, disappointment and anger warring in his expression, but before he could protest, Henry held up a hand. "However, we are willing to reconsider our partnership on 2 non-negotiable conditions." He turned to look directly at Harriet, his eyes kind but resolute. "First, Mrs. Baltimore must be fully involved in the company's management from this point forward. You will teach her, train her, and guide her in all aspects of the business." "Secondly," Ben added, "Mrs. Baltimore's shares in the company must be restored. We believe it's crucial for her to have not just a role in management, but a vested interest in the company's success." Nate's jaw dropped in disbelief. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. "She doesn't know anything about running a company. She's the reason I had to step in and save the business in the first place. And those shares, I bought them fair and square." Harriet flinched at his words, the truth of them stinging despite their harshness. "Nate," she said softly, "that's because I didn't know anything about the company. I used the money to maintain our lifestyle because I didn't know how else to manage it." Still processing this revelation, she added, I didn't realize I had given up my ownership in the company. I thought I was just signing over management control to you." Henry's expression softened slightly at Harriet's words. "This is precisely why these conditions are non-negotiable, Nathaniel. Your mother needs to be involved, to understand the business she's a part of. This isn't just about making money, it's about preserving a legacy, a family legacy." Nate shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Why is this so important to you? It's our company, our family. Why do you care how we run it?" Henry leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Because, Nathaniel, how someone treats their family is a direct reflection of their character. Your dedication to teaching and involving your mother in the business will show us your dedication and steadfastness in maintaining our business relationship. To me, that's as valuable as any contract or guarantee." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This belief system extends to my own family and to everyone I do business with. I've learned that you can tell a lot about a person and a company by looking at their family dynamics. Right now, your company might be growing well, but with your current attitude, I'd wager it would only last for the next 10 to 15 years. I don't want to make a deal with a company that might only last that long." The room fell silent as Henry's words hung in the air. Nate sat still, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Harriet felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope that things might change, that she might have a chance to understand the business her husband had built, that she and Nate might rebuild their relationship. Finally, Nate spoke, his voice strained but determined. "All right, I'll do it. I'll teach my mother about the business, involve her in the management." Henry nodded, satisfied. He produced a document from his briefcase. "I'll need you both to sign this. It's an agreement reflecting our new terms, including Mrs. Baltimore's involvement in the company." As Nate and Harriet signed the document, Henry added one final condition. "There's one more thing, Nathaniel," he said, his tone unwavering. "When we return to the main hall, you will make a public announcement. You will apologize to your mother in front of everyone for your behavior tonight and welcome her into your company." Nate's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious. That would ruin my reputation. What does all this have to do with anything? Are you trying to blackmail me?" But Henry was unmoved. "It's non-negotiable. Your mother spoke up for you earlier, defended you like you were a little boy. You owe her this apology." Harriet, overwhelmed by the turn of events, found her voice. I would appreciate that, Nate. You've given me a lot of heartache over the years, especially today." Ben, who had been quietly observing, added, "And for this partnership to work, we'll be posting a representative from our company and yours to ensure these conditions are met." Nate laughed humorlessly, shaking his head at the audacity of it all. But in the end, he nodded. "Fine. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." As they prepared to return to the main hall, Harriet felt a mix of emotions swirling within her: fear of the public spectacle to come, hope for a better future, and a tiny spark of something she hadn't felt in years, the beginnings of self-respect. Whatever happened next, she knew that tonight had marked a turning point. For better or worse, nothing would ever be the same again. The group made their way back to the main event hall, the sound of conversation and clinking glasses growing louder as they approached. Harriet's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through her veins. Nate walked stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched, the muscle twitching beneath his skin, a clear sign of his inner turmoil. As they reached the grand doors, Harriet took a deep breath, knowing that whatever lay ahead would forever change the delicate balance between mother and son. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years she felt ready to face it.